Good evening, friends. My name is Will Tatum, and I am your Dutchess County historian. Tonight is the fourth annual Black History Month program that the Dutchess County Government Department of History has sponsored. Every year, we look forward to bringing new and innovative explorations of Dutchess County Black history to light through our continuing partnership with the Dutchess County Historical Society. Our speaker tonight is Bill Jeffway, the long-serving executive director of the Dutchess County Historical Society. Bill has been a Milan resident for over 20 years, and during that time has brought many stories of Indigenous and Black county residents to light through his articles and presentations. He serves on the research committee of the Poughkeepsie-based Celebrating the African Spirit group and sits on the external advisory committee of Vassar College's Inclusive History Initiative. His presentation tonight is titled Navigating Wealth and Poverty: The Economic Diversity of Dutchess County's 19th Century Black Community, and will offer new and exciting insights into how Black residents of Dutchess County achieved enormous success despite many challenges leveled against them. Please join me in welcoming Bill Jeffway.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Dutchess County Department of History and Dutchess County for supporting us. Makes a big difference, and I'm very pleased to have the continual support of Dutchess County. So thank you, Will, for that as well. I'm going to start by stepping way back and talking about how we're approaching this. It is, of course, Black History Month. Navigating wealth and poverty, as you'll see, I ended up focusing a lot on water. So there's a little bit of a pun in there that you'll see emerging. And, you know, there's a lot of discussion about what history should we study, what history should we talk about. And the Historical Society and history community in general has had a philosophy that we're called to tell as complete and whole a history as possible, and that this calls on us to continually investigate. And I first arrived, it was the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. We were looking at veterans. We looked at the lesser told women's history stories on the 100th anniversary of the right to vote. Our current focus in our yearbook is on firefighting, and you get into it and you start to realize, wow, the firefighting stories really are lesser told stories. There's a lot to learn. So we're always called to write, if you will, and document a more complete history. But it was said most elegantly and eloquently by Vassar Professor Salmon over a century ago, and she talked about this constantly. And this book that she published, the line to everything she said, there's nothing more serious than to need to constantly rewrite history. And I think she intentionally was using provocative words because we initially think, well, why would it be good to rewrite history? But she tells us it depends. It depends if we're challenging ourselves each day to find a truer perspective. And she explains that there are new technologies. She would have loved the web, new information, new voices, new ways of studying. And she implored everyone to go to the source. So I just wanted to remind everyone about the kind of the philosophy of the Historical Society in terms of what we approach. Our annual award for historical research is given in the name of Helen Wilkinson Reynolds, and it's for someone who has excelled in the pursuit of historical truth. So that's what we do, whether it's Black history or firefighting history or women's history, is we try to find source material that informs a truer and more complete picture. So with that background, I do like to step way back and remind us that we, the Europeans, are relatively recent arrivals in the Hudson Valley. And there, as long as 12,000 years ago, indigenous people were settling here. And by the time Henry Hudson arrived in 1609, and the economic drivers were really New Amsterdam and Orange, Fort Orange, today's Albany. It really wasn't economically developing in the middle in Dutchess County until the early 18th century. And I mentioned a couple of years there. 1714 is when a census was done. There were 422 residents of Dutchess County, and we were part of Ulster County. 1728 is an important date. It was when the first Quaker kind of crept into southeastern Dutchess County. And so you find the settlement of Eastern Dutchess, although it's never anywhere near as dense, it is as early as the western part of the county. And 1744 is when the last patent, the Little Nine Partners patent in the North, gets divided up into units allocated to each of the partners. And so it really isn't until the mid 18th century that you start getting European driven economy around Dutchess County. The phrase follow the money, I've kind of amended here to say follow the water. If you ever wondered why New York State is like a T-bone steak on its side, it's because we have the Hudson River north and south and the Mohawk River amplified by the Erie Canal east and west. And we just happen to be halfway in between the cusp of the Atlantic Ocean and the joining of the Mohawk River. So this really these rivers and these waterways really shaped and drove the Empire State economy, literally to the shape that it is today. At first, New Amsterdam, and then New York City. Looking back at that period before contact, what I find interesting is if we go to the next level of looking at tributaries and streams and waterways into the Hudson, you'll see that that Dutchess County is largely settled around the Fishkill and Wappinger Creek, and the U-shaped roll of Chanson-Kill happened to have been the southernmost reach of the Mohican, while the streams that our county has been formed around were the northernmost reach of the very vast Lenape or Delaware that you can see in that left-hand in that big left-hand map, with the Schaghticoke to the east, uh, an assembling of many different tribes, and the Esopus to the west. So there's, I think, something very special and distinct about our county when you look at the waterways that are under it, because we're halfway between New York and Albany. We are organized around streams like any settlement, and that helps us understand how the economy grew here as we had European settlement. One of the things that strikes me about looking at the Black community through an economic lens is that it really was participating and involved in every stage of the process that was both from a global reach to a state reach to a county reach. And by that, I'm reminding us that when you look at the earliest settlement in the 17th century, New York was settled, of course, by the Dutch East India Company as a business with trading at Fort Orange with indigenous people for beaver pelts primarily and others. And I've put Peter Stuyvesant on the left and the Stockbridge Munsee, a man named John Quinney, and reminded us that Albany's early seal and its seal today had a beaver in it. And this was the central financial and economic driver of the time, pelts for Europe. So that from the earliest days in the 17th century of settlement, we had kind of a global trading arrangement based on a global business. If you look then into the 18th and early 19th century, Dutchess County starts to get settled in. And I like to describe it as if you imagine the landings along Dutchess County, along the Hudson River as gears, you had inland agricultural goods being grown and livestock raised. that were brought to the Hudson River in exchange for global manufactured goods. And I've given an example there of the inn as that is a camwood dye red, and you'll find out a bit later why I chose that in particular as an import. But we would have these sophisticated imports at the landing, and we would have the output of inland agricultural groups. Alas, our county seal has wheat in it. And in the way that the beaver for Albany represented the early economics, the wheat for Dutchess County reflects the early economics of the agricultural farming. And the Black community was embedded very much across the county in both built-up areas and rural areas, in part because slavery was very pervasive in both in rural areas and built-up areas. So when we start to talk about the Dutchess County economy, I want to talk about it in terms of the landings being almost a set of gears that are creating an exchange of our agricultural goods for global manufactured goods and imports. Before I do that, though, I want to give us a kind of barometer to look at the progress of wealth. And this is a professor, late Dr. A.J. Williams Myers, who spoke about attempts to dispossess the African and the ambition of the African in the 18th and 19th century to become possessors of their own property. So this was his way of talking about the scale of the ambition from moving from an enslaved person to a property owner, even to a business owner. And we'll look at people who fall in this kind of transitionary stage. So I wanted to just set as a background this barometer with a couple of examples of each of them. If we look at the dispossessed part, when I started studying local Black history 20 years ago, we were almost making an effort to help people understand that we didn't have a replication of Southern slavery here, and that slave quarters like you would find on a Southern plantation were rare. Um, we were trying to emphasize that there was almost a more intimate relationship with the enslaved. They were sleeping in the floor above you in the attic or in the basement. They were in the kitchen, and there was a familiarity and proximity that was very different from Southern plantation life. As we discovered and researched more, though, we did find that particularly in the 18th century, and I'd say before the founding of the United States, these specific areas are described as having slave quarters. So there were enough enslaved persons that they had separate enslaved quarters. And that's the old Livingston Manor in Columbia County in Claremont, also Livingston House. And then the Almont at Red Hook had slave quarters that were visible. We found around 1900 newspaper references still describing the fact that they were visible. There are references to slave quarters at a house at the Amy House in Clove Valley, and descriptions of the Everett plantation in Amenia as having slave quarters. But this seems to have been very early, and I think largely before the formation of the United States. And a lot of the red dots across Dutchess County are just random instances, not particularly thoughtful, but just to communicate that there was a much more pervasive distribution of enslaved persons. So what happens in 1827 when slavery is abolished in New York? You start to get to what I am calling here this kind of transitionary period. And it's transitionary because you suddenly have a lot of enslaved persons who are suddenly free. What do they do? It happens to be at the same time that there are a lot of Irish working class immigrants coming in willing to do similar jobs at little pay. And so you have this transitional period where a lot of men, women, and children are finding themselves free, but without a kind of logical off-ramp. And as New York became free, it became a destination for freedom seekers from the South. So we also saw a great growth in the Black community after 1827 as freedom seekers from the South were either transiting through Dutchess County or in some instances chose to live here. So suddenly there were a lot of communities with a lot of people with little to no money. And I've come up with at least half a dozen instances where there are descriptions of Blacks living in lean-tos against the side of a hill. And I just want to read several that have come up separately. In Hyde Park in New Guinea, the local historian Brayman kept a very detailed journal about the Black community there, and he talked about a Solomon Garnett, who he said lived in a rude stone house, half cellar, in the side of a hill on the North Road. The history of Columbia County talks about Guinea Hill, a settlement of Negroes at a little distance from the village of Kinderhook. The huts are of very rude construction, some of them partly underground, gaining their scanty substance from the forest's game, that should say, not fame, and fish of the creek. And that both gives us an indication of how crude the living was and also where they were beginning to try to make a living by hunting game and fish. Separately, Burton Coon, a local historian in Milan, wrote, Peter Jackson of Milan lived in a hut that sat partly in the side of a knoll with a thatched roof, a thatched room. And then finally, and I'm going to end today by reading in detail some of the diary of Thomas Sweet Lossing, the son of Benson Lossing, the historian in Dover. But he wrote of the Tompkins place in Dover, lived an old slave in a dirt cellar dug in the side of a hill. The cellar was roofed over with logs, holding a sloping roof of earth. And so you just can't encounter it so many times without realizing that this really must have been a relatively common thing. And there are other references. I'll talk a bit more about Boys Town and Poughkeepsie, where you get the feeling that slavery ended, maybe freedom seekers came, and there were just more people than could be handled economically. And as a result, they were in the most rudimentary of housing and living somehow off the hunting of game or fish, or as you'll see later, picking berries or making baskets, very basic things. Boys Town is interesting because we can trace it across a century. In 1834, in the map that I'll be talking about later, which was the blueprint of growth for Poughkeepsie, we see a little reference to Boys Town. A couple of decades later, we've discovered reference to a white woman finding refuge in Boys Town among a quote unquote Negro settlement. I suspect, though, it was a very rudimentary settlement. And these are the kinds of things that don't show up on census records, which means census records are undercounting a good portion of the community. So what we do know about Boys Town, and I would imagine that a good portion of the town were formerly enslaved persons to the Boyce family, that they were considered a quote unquote Negro community by the 1850s and 60s, where even white women in trouble were finding refuge. And that a century later in the 1930s, when a redlining map was created for Poughkeepsie, the redlining map has a lot of the North, and then it just has this one isolated section. And that one isolated section today would be Glendale Avenue. And it says this would get an A rating, except that the houses are not well constructed. It was an old Negro settlement. And how amazing to me that over a century later, there were still remnants of this quote unquote Negro community that never really showed up in census records and in later maps, except in this incredible way. So these are some examples from the Millbrook Historical Society. of a quote unquote Negro community there. That this is again the people don't own their land, or they might think they own the land, and don't necessarily, very transient people. So, and again, largely off the record, not that you will find in census records. Uh, but there are also the transient people with success stories, and a couple of them I want to touch on have to do with the Bolin family. You will have heard the name, coming out of Washington, and then the story of the Brown brothers, also in Washington. And we believe the Bolins and the Browns were freedom seekers from, if not New Jersey, then further south, and Mechanic and Liberty Street. So there's a little bit of the orange caution for transition, but some green there saying there's a green light as they were able to find economic stepping stones to grow. And A.J. Williams Myers is probably most famous for describing the importance of free Black communities like Freemanville, Baxtertown, and New Guinea because of the crossing the line from being dispossessed to possessing property, which at that time was a requirement for voting. So here, going up that spectrum from dispossessed, transitioning to property ownership, the interesting thing to me is that these very basic houses were also built into the side of the wall, starting at the bottom of a hill. Bottom right, Freemanville, I think his name is Caesar Freeman, bought land there. And a history depicted a typical, they were being facetious calling it a palace, built into the side of a hill. But so you see, it's still built into the side of a hill, but it's a more significant house on top. If you go to the very top, that White House in 1833, a woman bought the property here. It was quite a wide lot on Oak Street, which had been subdivided and for 2 decades drew just Blacks from the local community, former enslaved persons. The thing to point out, though, her original house is not the big thing you see, largely, but to the left of the door is a little is a little uh, lean-to like thing. That was the original house. Uh, these original houses were sometimes no bigger than 17 feet square. If we go to the left in New Guinea, that green house, that's Peter Griffin's house. He was one of the first Blacks to buy land in Hyde Park in 1811. And guess what? His original house, not the big house, his original house was a 17 by 17-foot square built into the side of the hill in New Guinea. And then we finally see just below that in black and white what we think was Quackenbush's house, which appears to be also built into the side of the hill. So it is kind of repeating, but on a grander scale. And I think in every instance, and we know that there were whites as well who were building houses in this way, that people without means and without money kind of built from the earth up to the degree they could. And anyway, this is a kind of a sign of greater wealth because at least these people owned property and were beginning to get on the way to go up the property ladder. Uh, those were pre-Black communities. If you look at kind of a next stage of evolution, I called it into the center, we find Blacks going beyond just the free Black communities into the center of villages and cities. And I'll give you an example. Starting at the top in red, that is Lewis Frazier's home in the village of Rhinebeck. And then counterclockwise in Hyde Park, Dunbar Brown's house. He was a former slave to the Pendleton family in Hyde Park. And after his freedom, he was able to build and construct this house. The house still stands, and he ended up moving to New York for economic reasons and started a whitewashing business there. But he had the economic means by 1850, after having been a slave, to build this house for himself and his family. Then down on the left in New Hamburg, Clint Williams was a ship captain, and his father was involved in boating, as was his two sons, and they owned houses right in the center of New Hamburg. To the right, the Boland family. Remember, we said the Bolands were out in the town of Washington, and they moved to Poughkeepsie right after the Civil War, and they raised 12 children in a house that still stands, that red house on North Hamilton Street. So these are examples where Blacks are living not just in free Black communities, but in the center of town. And we'll really get to some examples when we get to Poughkeepsie, and in particular look at barbers and tailors and tinsmiths. But we're going to save that for a little bit later when we get to Poughkeepsie. These are just examples. I think if you went anywhere in depth, like I did in Rhinebeck and Northern Dutchess, there's a street in Red Hook named Prince Street after Prince Ellsworth, who built a house there. St. Paul Road is named after a Black family, a Black farming family in the town of Milan. And Alexander Gilson had this house. He was a gardener. And I know that if we take any particular town, we will find a great number of persons of color living there in this dispersed way. Last but not least, what could be better than property ownership is business ownership. One of the most famous in Hyde Park is Henry Jenkins. His father, Richard Jenkins, was enslaved. Henry Jenkins not only owned his own property, he owned a very successful business, barbershop business. He is not shown there, but we believe that's his barbershop, the building on the right in the circle. And that is now the site of the post office in Hyde Park. But this was the ultimate. Henry Jenkins owned the property and he owned a successful business in it. We talked about Captain Williams in New Hamburg. That's a model of his boat, Little Martha. Captains at the time were responsible for an enormous amount of money because they were those gears in the exchange of agricultural goods and import. So they were responsible for an enormous amount of money and had a lot of respect as a result of that. In our exploration of Baxtertown as a free Black community, we found that west of that in Carthage Landing, that a Black man from Maryland, Isaac Dorsey, was running a boarding house. I don't know the image, so that's kind of a placeholder. But how interesting as you start to even look at the free Black communities like Baxtertown, that we find these peripheral places, and there were others in surrounding villages. You know, as you spend more time studying this and you peel back layers, you just find more and more detail and more pervasiveness of the Black community in all parts of the county. So I wanted to put that down first so that as we look through, I've organized it so we can look at global, state, and local economics. Just bear these descriptors in mind about the kind of barometer of or degree of wealth or economic success, especially in terms of property ownership and business ownership. So that'll act as our backdrop. The stories of global, remember we started out with the Dutch running us basically as a business, running what was New Amsterdam as a business. And so it shouldn't be too surprising that one of the most famous Black sea captains, Paul Coffey, his last name is spelled Cuffee, but he took the name of his father, Kofi, an African name. His father was taken from Africa and enslaved. So Paul Coffey was based in New Bedford, but was famous for being a Black whaling captain. This is the days when when ships would go out for 2 to 3 years on a sailing expedition and then come back loaded with whale oil and sperm oil and bone. Paul Coffey ended up trading in ways I'll explain in a moment. The other gentleman there is a more local gentleman who used whaling as a platform to end up actually in Australia. So this is Paul Coffey, and he had a bark, which I understand has to do with a certain number of sails. This is not my area of expertise, but they had a bunch of smaller boats that they would have to lower and literally go out and wrestle the whale, kill it, bring it to the side, cut it up, and so on. But there is a very famous book called The Negro as Capitalist that actually describes some interaction of Paul Coffey and Poughkeepsie. They explain that Coffey was involved in some uh, repatriation of blacks back to Sierra Leone. This was the early days when there were questions about whether it would make sense for free blacks to try to build a community in Sierra Leone that they could then leverage economically as a black community globally. I don't have to tell you that turned out not to be a great idea, but these were early days. He was trying to find a way to save his people from what he saw as kind of a hopeless situation in the United States. But the book tells us that Kofi purchased camwood at $100 per ton for a return voyage and sold it at Poughkeepsie. And what he would do is there were certain items like camwood, which is a small bushy tree that's just found in West Africa, and find room for it on his ship because it was so valuable. And Aidan Chisholmore in our collections group found this for me. This is a sample from the Innes Dye Works in Poughkeepsie of camwood. And I'm thinking, that is a 140-year-old piece of coloring there, and still looks pretty good. So you can see the attraction of camwood. So we know that Paul Coffey was at least trading in camwood in Poughkeepsie at our landings. And if you looked at ads at the time, would have been about 1815. He died quite young. If you looked at the apothecary, Barnes and Willoughby in Poughkeepsie, you'd find among the things you could buy there were camwood. So camwood was bought individually by people in powdered form and also on a larger scale from people like the Innes Dye Works, to which this little sample belongs. The big plan, the improvement party from the 1830s in Poughkeepsie, involved the creation of its own whaling company. And I think we don't know exactly where or how Alfred Brown stepped off onto a whaling boat from Poughkeepsie. You'll remember Alfred Brown was one of those folks living in the town of Washington who we said made a positive transition economically. And here he is in some of his whaling gear. I don't know that they were able to make it tonight, but I have worked for some time with two descendants of this gentleman, Alfred, and that is Jan Green in New Zealand and Christine Johnson in Australia. And in the 1840s, that gentleman from Washington went and got a seaman's protection certificate, which in the day and age when black was not necessarily a citizen, a seaman's protection certificate gave him a great deal of status and protection. And we know a lot about Alfred because he kept up a 50-year correspondence with his brother Alonzo in Poughkeepsie. And I'll tell you more about him when we get to the Poughkeepsie section. But here's an example, not of a global trader like Paul Coffey coming to Poughkeepsie, but of a Dutchess County man, Alfred Brown, stepping onto whaling boats, finding the life attractive, and ending up continuing to live in what would have been New Holland at the time. And we have a journal from an 1840 trip of the bark Vermont out of Poughkeepsie, and it took them about 6 or 8 months to get to New Holland in their boat. So those are two examples of global trade one with a global trader and one with a local person gone global. These are photos of Alfred, top left, who stayed in Poughkeepsie. Alonzo in the middle is the brother that ended up going to uh, Australia. That is his son, Abraham Lincoln Brown. And that is Christine Johnston, who is standing by the graves of the Brown family of Poughkeepsie at the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery. She was recently here on a visit, and she's written an article about her trip from Australia and the discovery of her Black ancestors that's going to be in our yearbook that is coming out in April. So another reason to look out for our yearbook, Christine's article on that. So he ended up really just building a life in Poughkeepsie. That's a snapshot sample of global trade. Let's talk about New York focus. I have come to learn that there was a Wall Street baron. Remember, these are the days when the Vanderbilts and these persons were kind of ravenous with their appetite for money. And it turns out that Jeremiah Hamilton, who at the time, in just before the Civil War, was known as a Wall Street baron, an investor, a speculator, and known as the only Black millionaire at the time, that Jeremiah Hamilton was a big investor in Poughkeepsie. And we know that because this map was created in 1835, and it was created by the improvement parties that was led by Matthew Vassar and a New York City investor called John Delafield. And this map was the master plan for growth. And just for reference, I've put a red line that runs from, that is Main Street running from Academy to the river. And the star is the courthouse at the corner of Main and Market, just for orientation, because I'm going to come back to some other points on this. But if this is the blueprint for growth, there were three things in particular that caught the attention of this Black millionaire investor. And the first was Union Landing. So now Union Street does not connect through to Market the way it did then, but you can see it's just from a side of the courthouse, goes down Union Street, parts of which still remain. And Union Landing was a really important part of that landing. And I think I have somewhere what that consisted of. Let me just see if I have. He bought uh, the Union Landing was a 400-foot long dock, had three large storehouses, 5 acres of land suitable for a mansion house with a view. He was in the process of purchasing two steamboats, 175 tons each, and he was put out an ad hiring people who could help in the freighting and towing business. So he was making a big investment by buying a landing and surrounding land in 1835. That was not all. Oh, I put this in because he was notorious for overinsuring, and then there'd be an accidental fire in New York City. He was kind of notorious for that and had a bad reputation, and certain underwriters wouldn't carry him anymore. And I couldn't help but notice that very shortly after he bought the land at Union Landing, there was a fire, completely destroyed and insured by Hartford Insurance. However, it was just $250. I think that pales in comparison to what he was doing in New York City, but still couldn't help but notice that there was suddenly an insurance fire. This reflects the Fallkill going to Upper Landing, just above Main Street. And he was an investor in the silk factory. So there was a kind of a silk craze. People were growing mulberry bushes, some of those orchards off to the right of the Fallkill in the later map in 1834. would have been mulberry trees. And you can see that that whole area north of the Fallkill was nothing but farmland in 1819. And we're only talking, what, 15 years later. So if you're looking north of Fallkill, you see what happens is they put in a whaling dock. They build out Upper Landing. They close that kind of cove and fill it with fill. And they name the streets after themselves. So that's why we have Delafield, Winfield the engineer, Talmadge was the politician who was an investor. And so this was the building up of that area of Poughkeepsie. Uh, these are the subscribers to the Silk Company. Nathan Talmadge was kind of a ruthless politician who seemed to have a lot of conflicting financial interests. And John Delafield was the city investor that no doubt was the connection to Jeremy Hamilton. This is comparing an 1819 map to 1834. You can see that what was just farmland was planned to have Mansion Street and Mansion Square built. And this is maybe the most amazing thing that he bought. John Delafield had built this beautiful Greek Revival mansion house on the northeast corner of Mansion Square. It ends up being a hotel or an ice cream and mead garden, as they had it. I put a picture of a house in Georgia that's kind of the same style, because we don't, for some strange reason, have any photographs of that Mansion Street house, despite it being so amazing. So it was actually built and it was bought by Jeremiah Hamilton. So he is an investor in the silk mill. He owns Union Landing and the land around it, and he owns a chunk of Mansion Square. And the belief of the author who profiled him was that he was planning to move to Poughkeepsie and actually live here and move from New York City. So that would have been amazing. Uh, Bad timing, though, the 1837 economic collapse meant that literally all of them went bankrupt in some form or other. And Jeremiah Hamilton lost all those investments, as did others. 1837 was an extraordinary financial collapse in the United States. So the big ambitious plan didn't go quite as planned. I wanted to also look at an orientation toward Albany, and a good example of that is Abram Bolin. He led the effort in the 1870s after the 15th Amendment, after the Equal Protection Clause opened up opportunities for thinking about things like schools of higher education for Blacks. He actually led a successful effort for the Assembly to incorporate a higher college level school of learning that would have been for Blacks only. It was incorporated fine, but the funding was never generated. But Abram Bolin was a leader in Albany at a state level on educational issues. And his son, Gaius Bolin, first Black graduate of Williams College and first Black lawyer in the county, had a very good relationship with Theodore Roosevelt. Gaius Bolin was writing a lot publicly about why Blacks should support the Republican Party, and Theodore Roosevelt took notice when Roosevelt was governor and asked Gaius Bolin to be the representative for the New York building at the New York Pan American Exposition in 1901. So Gaius Bolin was developing a kind of political profile the way his father had in Albany, with a view to building Black education and building Black business. So I think we know that that was at that exposition that President McKinley was shot and Teddy Roosevelt became president, and Gaius Bolin was a lifelong Republican supporter. This is an amazing story about a New York politician, Walter K. Mowers. He was called Professor Mowers. He was a barber in Amenia, but he was a shrewd politician. And he was a Democrat, and he worked his way up in politics. such that he got rewarded with a job to be the messenger and assistant to the Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, C.N. Jordan, who signed the money at the time. And the amazing thing is, poor Mr. Mowers, the professor, in 1887, he died at work in the office of the U.S. Treasurer. And I just think, what an amazing story from a barber in Armenia to an unfortunate heart attack at this U.S. Secretary of the Treasury's office. But he developed his, and he's listed in the official publications with his civil service income and so on. This was a guy who was building a kind of a career or economics through politics. I find that an amazing story. We will spend a little time just looking at a county level, right? We looked at kind of the global dynamics of things. We looked at some state level. I want to give a few examples of what was going on with the county and what was getting exchanged at the, in this case, at the foot of Main Street, the Exchange Hotel, and set for both. So let me just share a few examples of the kind of county level economics. Farmers and landowners, the most important, one of the most extraordinary landowners is Andrew Fraser. He was born enslaved at the manor of Morrisania, and when the Graham family moved up to Northern Dutchess, he came with them and earned his freedom, most likely by serving in the Revolutionary War. And he ended up in kind of a reversal of fortune because his prior owner, Morris Graham, like many did, effectively bankrupted himself, investing in the Revolutionary War. And Morris Graham ends up retiring in obscurity to upstate New York. Andrew Fraser earns his freedom and builds his economic wealth through farmland in the town of Milan, kind of a low-cost entry town. And then his sons build on that farm, and the Frasers are in Dutchess County for many generations and have a history of serving in the U.S. Armed Services. His great-granddaughter was the head of the Women's Auxiliary for Harlem Hellfighters. But the point here is that the Fraser family, for generations, built wealth through farming, even though the land was poor and challenging. Staying in the town of Milan, where the land is poor, but as a result more accessible to people who didn't necessarily have a lot of money, what you find is extraordinary is how many Black women own land. So the biggest woman landowner in the town of Milan was Elmira Jackson. She owned 108 acres. And with her husband, Henry, she owned another 33. But the Jacksons were also very successful farmers in the town of Milan as landowners. Primus Martin, this is the
Oh,
overlay, the Hyde Park, New Guinea community. And you see
right.
right in the middle there, Primus and Betty Martin, they had a farm. It was rocky land. It most likely could have been raising sheep, would not have been growing wheat because the farmland was so bad. And across from him, Quackenbush was also a man attempting to make a living at farming. And what we do know about Quackenbush, because we have a signed lease with Samuel Bard, is that he was a Black man who had the option to purchase his lot that we had just looked at from Samuel Bard for a certain amount of money, but he was never able to raise the money, so he remained a tenant. But he was a well-known farmer at New Guinea. You could make money from wood in those days. Another yearbook article that I can recommend is by Zachary Veith at Statsburg State Historic Site. He wrote in our yearbook that will be out in April about the woodlot called Hawktown in Statsburg. And we discovered this is from our collections. This Cheryl's woodlot was sold, and there was a Black community that was built in this area. And one can only imagine that their livelihood was through timber and wood and perhaps the kind of fish and game that was referred to before. but this is an interesting story. Richard Jenkins, he worked as a sexton for the church at Hyde Park. He and his wife both, it's laid out in perfect form what they were paid. She largely did cleaning and washing, and Richard Jenkins was the sexton, and he's depicted in the far right of the Hyde Park post office murals by Olin Dowse, and that's a photograph of him. Richard Jenkins, top right, 1833, that's when he bought that big wooded lot in the middle. The yellow line is Fredonia Lane, where we saw Primus Martin and Quackenbush. And then the others are to the left and more toward the village. So you can see the kind of emerging population of property ownership. And at least in the area of Fredonia Lane, we were looking at farming or woodlots. I'm going to go through kind of end by looking at local business, first in Poughkeepsie in the city, and then local in rural, and then we will wrap up, keeping an eye on time. So the kind of classic roles for Blacks at that time were barbers and tailors for sure. Jared Gray kind of seems to have taught others like Uriah Boston and Charles Vermong the business. John Bolding, and then Jared Gray expanded from barbering into selling clothing. And Alonzo Brown, you'll remember we talked about the Browns from Washington. Alfred went on to Australia, and Alonzo stayed here and became a well-known and very financially successful tinsmith. This is Alonzo Brown. Remember Alfred Brown, who went off to Australia, and the two brothers wrote letters for 50 years that the descendants have. That's why we know so much about them. You'll notice that he ended up on Mechanic Street in Poughkeepsie. So he was out of the town of Washington into Poughkeepsie by 1867. He was a laborer. Then you'll find he's a tinsmith. Then you'll find he's likely an owner because the bold means he's running an ad of sheet iron works. And then by 1906, he really owns his own tin and sheet iron works. And he manufactured and repaired stoves, and was able to buy property. So this building, it's right across from the family partnership. He bought the one on the end, number 32. That was his, where he spent his later life. So this is, if we go back to A.J. Williams Meyer's hierarchy, this is the highest form in that he owned property in his house and he owned and ran a successful business, the way Henry Jenkins did with his barbering business. But this is kind of the highest order of a barometer. This is a look at local within a very rural area. And we're very lucky to have the diaries of Thomas Sweet Lossing, the son of Benson Lossing. He was writing in the 1930s about his childhood in the 1870s in Dover. And that gives you the kind of insight you can't get through anywhere else. Local, probably as famous as barbers and tailors are gardeners, right? James Brown with the Verblanc family. A book's been written by Myra Armstead about the diary he kept. Alexander Gilson was a botanist who developed the double blossoming begonia, which has an official Latin name of Begonia gilsonia. John Britton of Millbrook came back from the Civil War, became a famous gardener, as did Quackenbush. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through these, but James Brown for Verplank, Alexander Gilson is recognized in Red Hook for having really not been just a gardener, but a botanist. John Britton, courtesy of the Millbrook Historical Society. Thank you for that. John Britton again, and John Britton had descendants into the 2000s until relatively recently living there. This is interesting economically because Lewis Fraser was born in Milan. Remember the Frasers, Andrew Fraser, the farmer, but he became a coachman. And it's another kind of classic role for blacks, if you will, in the period. This is the Rhinebeck post office murals by Olin Dowes and the depiction of a black coachman. But Lewis was able to turn the his work as a coachman into a really big economic stepping stone. He got a job in New York as a coachman to a wealthy family on Fifth Avenue, and he lived just around the corner on West 33rd off of Fifth Avenue. And he was very active there. He was involved with the Coachmen's Union, and he really raised his profile as an advocate for the Black community. And by moving to New York City, uh, being able to become financially well off enough to support his family. We have the amazing story of his daughter, Susan Elizabeth Fraser, Lewis Fraser's. She grew up on West 33rd Street. She became the first Black teacher allowed to teach white students. And as I mentioned before, she became the head of the Women's Auxiliary of the Harlem Hellfighters in World War I. And she was the last of her family to die and be buried in Rhinebeck. So she didn't have a headstone. And we recently did a campaign to create a headstone for her and suggest that her voice endures. She wrote and spoke a great deal about a woman's right, the capacity of women and the capacity of blacks, both gender and race. She felt were people who were being underutilized unnecessarily. Uh, so interesting transition. Then in Millbrook, again, if the highest order is owning a business, by the 1920s, there's a gentleman in Millbrook who's running a bus service company between Millbrook and Poughkeepsie, and I gotta love the cars. Um, but back to our barometer or gauge of possession, this is a guy running a business, so and owning a business of his own. I'm going to end by reading from the diary of Thomas Lossing. Give me just one moment, because it's the kind of thing you could only find in a diary. That's Benton Lossing's house, where Thomas Lossing grew up, the ridge, and then the circled in orange. And Thomas Lossing drew this amazing map. And I'm going to talk about two things. One, Anne Wing's place and Jackie Duncan's place in the South. So the son wrote this looking back in his childhood as an adult. Jackie Duncan lived in a house with a low gabled roof, patched almost beyond recognition, but a larger house than most of the color people had. It was covered with weather-beaten horizontal siding and honeysuckle and grapevines. Their garden patch in the front of the house was full of sweet corn, garden vegetables, sunflowers, and gourds. Their occupation mostly consisted in selling wild berries and making all kinds of splint baskets, which they sold to the farmers of the surrounding countryside. It was said of Jackie that he could make a watertight basket. Amos would often come to our place with all-sized baskets and usually succeeded in making a sale of some description, as we used a great many. There always had to be a replenishment of bushel baskets for corn husking, half bushel baskets for apple picking, and a basket about 6 inches wide and 14 inches long, which we painted red, for our mother's garden basket. In that basket, there were always a pair of gloves, a trowel, a ball of cord, and papers of seeds. One other basket we always had to be sure of having, that was my mother's key basket. It was about 6 inches square and 4 inches deep with a strong handle. And as I remember, it had enough keys for the Bastille. Um, and it talks about all the different ways that there were. But when we're looking at people who are literally just trying to get by, they don't own their property. Thomas Sweetlossing describes Anne Wing's estate as a plantation. He describes it as a place we would quote unquote go when we need colored help. When you look at a diary like this, you realize that there was a much bigger Black community in rural areas that was just not being counted. It was off the map because their houses were too crude, their economic situation was too precarious. And in looking at other either diaries or local histories that describe people in similar situations, we keep coming back to hearing about making baskets, hunting for game, hunting for fish, being an errand runner, maybe taking berries to a general store. And this, of course, all would have been moment to moment, very seasonal, certainly not something that's done 12 months a year. And it's amazing that that kind of scale of that community has remained so much off the map because we're so used to looking at standard things like census records and more traditional things or property records that just aren't going to be capturing the communities of these most rural and rudimentary of living situations. So that wraps it up. I hope we looked at A.J. Williams Meyer's idea of this path or ladder of progression to property and business ownership as kind of the gauge of success. And I hope we've come to understand that the economics here are very much global and statewide and countywide, and that the Black community was really participating in some way in each of these different levels. And with that, I will happily take questions.